All right, let's dive straight in. The date we're looking at is June 13, 2025. And something huge, something we've, speculated about, maybe feared, but didn't quite believe would actually happen. Well, it just happened in the Middle East. And the whole world is pretty much holding its breath.
That's right. We've been sifting through just a mountain of intense information, first alerts, early analysis, the initial reactions, all trying to piece together the immediate fallout from what looks like a truly seismic event, Israel launching massive military strikes against Iran.
And our job here, in this deep dive, it sounds simple, but God, it feels critical right now. We need to take this absolute torrent of information and try to figure out what in the hell is actually going on, who's saying what are the real stakes, and why you, listening now, absolutely need to get your head around this potentially world-altering shift. We're digging for those crucial nuggets, those really chilling implications buried in all this data.
Okay, so what do these initial reports actually say about the operation itself? They paint a picture of something on a scale we haven't really seen before. In the very early hours of June 13th, Israel unleashed this operation, codenamed Operation Rising Lion. And we're being told this is the most significant attack on Iran since the Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah, this was definitely not some minor surgical strike. The reports are talking about multiple waves, hundreds of individual strikes, hitting at least 8 different locations across Iran. And that includes targets right there in Tehran. It sounds like a really comprehensive, heavy blow.
And the targets themselves, well, based on the details coming out, they were incredibly specific. This wasn't just hitting random buildings. The focus seems laser sharp. Key Iranian nuclear facilities, sites like Natanz, Kandab, Karamabad are specifically named. Also ballistic missile factories, major military sites.
And here's where it gets, frankly, really intense, maybe even pretty damn dark. The reports suggest this operation specifically went after and reportedly killed senior military commanders. They're naming the IRGC chief, General Hossein Salami, possibly even the chief of staff, Mohammad Bagheri. And on top of that, key Iranian nuclear scientists were apparently also targeted and killed.
Right, and alongside those air attacks, there seem to have been coordinated covert sabotage missions hitting air defense systems. So this looks less like just damaging infrastructure and more like a calculated decapitation strategy.
So what's Israel saying? How are they justifying this?
Well, their justification is framed entirely as self-preservation, a necessary act, a preemptive, preventative strike against what they're calling an imminent existential threat. We've seen quotes from Prime Minister Netanyahu calling it a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival, and, maybe most chillingly, saying it will continue for as many days as it takes.
And the core argument for that imminent threat, the justification underpinning it all, according to the briefings, is stark. Apparently, Iran had gathered enough enriched uranium to potentially produce as many as 15 nuclear weapons within days. That's the nub of it.
But the timing, though, that's absolutely crucial here. This whole thing kicked off just days before a new round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks was scheduled to happen in Oman. And significantly, it came right after the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, had censured Iran for non-cooperation. That was the first censure like that in 2 decades.
So the thinking is Israel probably used that IAEA censure as part of its justification, right? Maybe saw this moment, Iran diplomatically isolated the U.S. talks at a really sensitive point as like a window of opportunity.
That seems to be the analysis, yeah. And what's incredibly significant, and this comes through loud and clear, is that the timing appears to have directly undercut U.S. diplomatic moves. There are reports it even defied warnings from President Trump urging Netanyahu not to take military action that could torpedo the talks.
Which brings us straight to the immediate fallout, Tehran's reaction. Well, you can imagine. Swift, furious, and completely unfiltered.
Furious might be an understatement, judging by the language. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is quoted declaring Israel had unleashed its wicked and bloody hand. And he issued this really chilling warning that Israel would face a bitter fate for itself and severe punishment.
And other officials echoed that.
Oh, yeah. Promises of a harsh and decisive response. And critically, Iran didn't waste a second explicitly stating that the United States, as Israel's principal backer, would bear responsibility for whatever happens next. That puts Washington in a really, really tight spot.
Yeah, and then there's the human cost being reported. That adds another just tragic layer to this. Beyond the targeted deaths of senior military figures and scientists, there are these deeply disturbing reports coming out about civilian casualties, including children, from strikes that allegedly hit residential areas.
If those reports are substantiated, that really throws a wrench into Israel's narrative of a purely targeted military operation, doesn't it? It could trigger massive international condemnation, questions under international humanitarian law.
Definitely. And meanwhile, Israel is clearly digging in, bracing for a major counterattack. The material we're seeing details really comprehensive emergency measures being rolled out across the country.
Like what?
A nationwide state of emergency. National airspace completely shut down, no arrivals, no departures. The population being warned to expect immediate missile and drone attacks, with the Home Front Command issuing specific instructions.
And they've called up reserves too, right?
Tens of thousands, yeah. These are huge preparations. It just underscores how seriously the Israeli government is taking the potential for Iranian retaliation. They know they kicked the hornet's nest.
Which puts Iran in what some analysts are calling this retaliation paradox. It's a hell of a bind. They absolutely have to respond. The response needs to be significant enough to look like a credible deterrent, satisfy domestic anger, especially after losing such high-profile people. But, exactly, that response has to be incredibly carefully calibrated to avoid triggering an all-out war with Israel and, potentially, the U.S. getting dragged in directly. It's walking a razor's edge.
And there's a potential twist, right? The analysis points out that taking out those senior leaders, while maybe a tactical victory for Israel in the short term, could actually backfire badly.
How so?
It could galvanize resolve in Iran. They'd turn these guys into martyrs. It might even empower the absolute hardest line factions who are now screaming for the most extreme retaliation possible. That could actually lead to a less predictable response, maybe involving proxies in new ways. It's just an unbelievably dangerous moment.
Which, drops the United States right into the middle of an absolute nightmare scenario. They're trying to walk this impossibly thin tightrope. The official U.S. line, which came out almost immediately after the strikes, was very, very carefully worded.
Extremely careful. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued statements saying unequivocally the U.S. was not involved in strikes against Iran, that Israel acted unilaterally. The official position we've seen is just that Israel advised Washington they felt these strikes were necessary for self-defense. That quick denial is absolutely crucial for the U.S. trying to maintain some distance.
But at the exact same time, the U.S. delivered a very stark warning directly to Tehran. Rubio is quoted again saying, "Let me be clear, Iran should not target U.S. interests or personnel. Protecting American troops and assets in the region was declared the absolute #1 priority."
And they'd already taken precautions, hadn't they? The partial evacuations.
Reportedly, yes. Partial evacuation of diplomatic staff, voluntary departures for families of U.S. troops. They were clearly anticipating trouble.
See, this is the really messed up part, isn't it? These Israeli strikes apparently just flew directly in the face of President Trump, reportedly urging Netanyahu to hold off, specifically because talks were ongoing. Trump worried it would blow any chance for a deal.
So the operation just completely sideswipes those planned U.S.-Iran talks in Oman. It leaves the U.S. looking reactive, caught off guard, and its main diplomatic strategy towards Iran is just, well, it's in tatters.
And there's that perception problem. The analysis points this out strongly. The U.S. saying it was only advised versus actually approving it. That might be a really hard sell, right? Especially for Iran and others in the region.
Absolutely. With such a close alliance, many will just assume prior knowledge implies tacit approval, regardless of the official statements. And that perception could seriously undermine any U.S. attempts to de-escalate things now. If Iran does hit U.S. interests in retaliation, that whole not involved claim comes under intense, possibly unbearable scrutiny.
Some of the analysis suggests this whole thing has visibly shoved aside the main diplomatic option, potentially pushing U.S.-Iran relations into a much more militarized and confrontational phase. It might even force the U.S. to lay down new, maybe tougher red lines for Israel, just to try and regain some semblance of control over this spiraling situation. It's a diplomatic car crash.
And that crash is sending ripples globally. We're seeing a whole spectrum of reactions from the major powers. China, for instance, their immediate focus seems quite pragmatic. Safety of their citizens, push for regional stability.
Their general stance usually favors multilateral diplomacy over this kind of unilateral military stuff, right?
Yeah.
They've tended to support Iran's peaceful nuclear program, opposed sanctions, often in line with Russia.
Speaking of Russia, yeah, they're a close strategic partner of Iran's. They're almost certainly going to condemn these strikes, maybe offer some kind of support. Though reports suggest their ability to act decisively might be somewhat limited by, their own ongoing war in Ukraine.
And the analysis suggests we need to view both China's and Russia's calls for diplomacy through the lens of their alignment with Iran and their broader goal of countering U.S. influence.
Exactly. You're likely to see competing diplomatic initiatives emerging from different corners.
What about Europe? The EU, the UK.
Expected response there?
Yeah.
Deep concern, urgent calls for maximum restraint, desperate attempts to salvage any remaining diplomatic possibilities. Their main worries are clear regional explosion, potential refugee crises, impact on energy security.
Might be some internal divisions within the EU, though, on how hard to condemn Israel.
Possibly. The UK generally tracks closely with the U.S. position, although, interestingly, they did recently sanction some Israeli ministers over West Bank violence, which shows some willingness to apply pressure.
And the international bodies. UN, IAEA.
They're stepping up. The UN Secretary General condemned any military escalation, particularly alarmed about attacks on nuclear sites right before talks. He's urging maximum restraint from everyone.
And the IAEA.
Their Director General confirmed they're closely monitoring this deeply concerning situation, confirmed Natanz was indeed hit, and they're talking directly with Iranian authorities about radiation safety and their inspectors on the ground.
But the analysis points out the UN Security Council's limitations here, right? Divisions, vetoes.
Yeah. It really highlights how hamstrung the UN can be in enforcing international law during these high-stakes showdowns. It risks further damaging trust in the UN's effectiveness.
Regional states must be panicking. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt.
Oh, absolutely. They mostly just want to avoid a massive regional war breaking out. The material suggests they have zero appetite for this and are desperate not to be forced into picking sides. Their big economic plans depend entirely on stability. Expect calls for de-escalation, maybe some quiet mediation efforts.
This whole thing puts unbelievable stress on the Abraham Accords, doesn't it?
Immense stress, perhaps unprecedented. The fear of a wider war, coupled with potential public anger in their own countries, could easily force these states to publicly distance themselves from Israel, regardless of any behind-the-scenes ties. It's a massive test for those agreements.
Egypt's in a particularly tough spot, too. Key mediator in Gaza, peace treaty with Israel, deeply worried about their own stability, borders, potential refugee flows, Sinai militants.
Right. And Turkey, another major regional player, often critical of Israeli policy. They'll almost certainly condemn the strikes, call for de-escalation, maybe try to position themselves as a mediator to enhance their own regional influence.
And we can't forget the proxies, like the Houthis in Yemen.
Definitely not. They're aligned with Iran, represent a major potential channel for retaliation. They might view the U.S. as complicit here and could try launching missiles or drones toward Israel or maybe hit Red Sea shipping again. That would significantly broaden the conflict.
But the most immediate gut reaction that hit the global markets, like a ton of bricks, the economic fallout is already happening, and it looks pretty damn scary.
Oh, hell yes. The material details just immediate, massive shockwaves ripping through energy and financial markets. The biggest reaction, oil prices. They went completely haywire.
Haywire how? What kind of numbers are we talking?
Pretty staggering jumps. Price increases from around 5% up to over 8%, even reports of 11-12% spikes in subsequent trading. We're apparently talking the largest single-day percentage jump for oil in years.
And the fear driving that is obvious, isn't it? Disruption to Middle East oil supplies, and the big nightmare scenario. Iran trying to interfere with, or even close, the Strait of Hormuz, that critical choke point.
Yeah, that's the ultimate fear for the energy markets. And beyond oil, the broader market reaction was just pure panic, uncertainty, fear of escalation. It triggered a classic flight to safety. Stock futures dropped sharply, big time. U.S. futures tumbled, Dow Jones futures down around 600 points, S&P 500 and NASDAQ 100 futures both dropping about 1.5%. Asian markets opened way down too.
So money fled to traditional safe havens.
Exactly. Gold reportedly surged, hitting a new record-high settlement price above $3,452 an ounce, according to the data. The Swiss franc strengthened. Meanwhile, riskier assets like Bitcoin took a dive.
And the analysts aren't mincing words, are they? This isn't just noise.
No, they're warning this could be more than just temporary volatility. Some are calling it a potential macro regime shift with really significant long-term consequences for the global economy.
The fears seem pretty concrete. Prolonged disruption to trade, travel, supply chains. If fuel and food prices stay high because of this, it'll hammer vulnerable populations and economies hardest.
Right. The markets aren't just reacting to today. They're pricing in the risk of sustained higher energy costs if this conflict drags on. That means more inflation, making central banks' jobs even harder, potentially hitting global growth.
And it signals wider fear, too, right? A general move away from risk globally.
That seems to be the underlying signal, yeah. Fear of broader economic contagion. It's a major warning sign flashing red.
Okay, so looking ahead, what does the analysis suggest we should be bracing for? What's the likely mess coming down the pipe?
Well, Iran's ability to retaliate is significant. There's no question about that. The reports mention U.S. intelligence estimates putting their ballistic missile count around 2,000, some capable of hitting Israel hard. Plus, they have sophisticated drone capabilities.
So potential actions could range from direct missile or drone attacks on Israel.
Right, or targeting U.S. interests or personnel in the region, or activating regional proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen.
But the analysis is a bit mixed on how effective Iran can actually be.
It is. Some experts argue Iran has few good options, maybe suggesting their proxies are somewhat weakened, and Israel's air defenses are pretty formidable. However, and this is crucial, there are reports that U.S. officials have privately warned a really large-scale Iranian barrage could potentially overwhelm Israeli defenses, leading to mass casualties. That's a terrifying possibility.
And the assassination factor.
Yeah.
Killing those top commanders and scientists, that adds a powerful emotional driver, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It could easily provoke a much more aggressive, maybe less predictable response, driven by pure revenge, needing to restore deterrence in a big way.
So the risk of this escalating further, potentially catastrophically, it's exceptionally high right now.
Frankly, it seems off the charts. You have Netanyahu saying the operation continues for as many days as it takes. You have Iran vowing severe punishment. The material we're seeing warns explicitly of a dangerous cycle of violence, a potential spiral of retaliation and counter-retaliation.
And the nightmare scenario of the U.S. getting dragged into a war it desperately wants to avoid. That's still very much on the table.
A massive looming concern, yes. Pathways to de-escalation look incredibly narrow right now. Some analysts suggest rapid de-escalation might be possible if Iran ultimately decides it fears a wider war against Israel, potentially backed by the U.S. more than anything else, and therefore limits its response, maybe something like we saw after the Soleimani strike.
Diplomatic efforts must be going on behind the scenes, even if they're damaged.
Undoubtedly, they'll be working channels frantically, but the critical unknowns are just huge. Nobody knows the actual extent of the damage to Iran's nuclear program yet. Nobody knows the precise nature, scale, or targets of Iran's retaliation when it comes. And maybe the biggest unknown, how will the United States react to that retaliation, especially if American interests are hit?
And the risk of just miscalculation, someone misreading a signal, overreacting.
That remains a critical, terrifying X factor. A simple mistake by any side could inadvertently light the fuse for a much wider, truly catastrophic regional war.
This situation also makes you think about historical parallels, doesn't it? Israel's done preemptive strikes before.
It has. Operation Opera against Iraq's Osirak reactor in '81, Operation Orchard against Syria's suspected Al-Kibar reactor in '07, both aimed at stopping perceived nuclear threats.
And the world reacted differently then.
Yeah, Opera got widespread condemnation, even a temporary U.S. arms freeze. Orchard, much less outcry, partly because Israel stayed silent and Syria was secretive about what was hit.
But the analysis makes it crystal clear why this time, hitting Iran like this, is exponentially more dangerous than those past raids.
Absolutely. Iran is just a much more powerful, regionally influential state. Its nuclear program is far more advanced, more dispersed, and this strike happened right in the thick of complex, great power diplomacy and maneuvering. It's the same underlying Israeli preemptive doctrine, often called the Bibin doctrine, but applied on a scale and against a target that carries vastly greater risks.
And there's a real danger of setting a terrible precedent here, isn't there? If Israel's actions don't face serious international pushback, if they're seen as sort of tacitly accepted.
It could significantly lower the threshold for future conflicts, yes. It might encourage other states facing what they perceive as existential threats to think, well, maybe unilateral military action is the way to go, completely bypassing diplomacy and international law.
The analysis warns that could lead to a much more unstable, much more dangerous world, especially in regions already rife with tension and nuclear ambiguity. International law around preemptive strikes is already murky, referencing things like the Caroline test needing an instant overwhelming threat, leaving no moment for deliberation. This event pushes those boundaries right to the breaking point.
Yeah, it really does.
So thinking longer term, what are the potential consequences here? How could this fundamentally redraw the map?
Well, Iran's nuclear future is now incredibly uncertain. The immediate physical damage might be substantial, but the analysis really questions whether strikes like this actually deter a regime like Iran's in the long run.
Could it backfire? Push them towards a bomb?
That's a very plausible, counterintuitive outcome. The attacks could absolutely galvanize Iranian resolve. They might decide, okay, the gloves are off, let's sprint for a nuclear breakout, maybe at more hidden, hardened facilities, or even make the strategic call to actively pursue weaponization now. Iran has already vowed to rebuild. Hitting deeply buried sites is militarily much harder anyway.
And the regional power balance, how does that shift?
It could go a couple of ways. There is one scenario, maybe less likely depending on how this immediate crisis plays out, where if Israel is seen as having won decisively, and maybe the Gaza situation also resolves in their favor, it could paradoxically clear the path for wider normalization deals with Arab states like Saudi Arabia. They might see a strong Israel as a useful counterweight to Iran.
But the more likely scenario, according to the analysis,
is probably that this conflict spirals into a much wider regional war, sucking in multiple countries, further destabilizing places already on the edge like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, even Gaza. That would mean an exponential worsening of humanitarian crises, mass displacement, food insecurity, unimaginable strain on aid efforts.
It could also push Iran even closer to Russia and China, right? Solidifying that adversary entente against the West.
Very likely. And the outcome, whatever it is, will inevitably reshape the United States' role and influence throughout the Middle East.
Yeah, the U.S. role in overall global stability seem directly threatened here. These Israeli strikes are a direct challenge to U.S. diplomatic strategy, forcing a major rethink of Washington's entire Iran policy.
Yeah.
If they're seen as undermining diplomacy or done without enough coordination, it could seriously ramp up U.S.-Israel tensions, too.
And a wider Middle East war exploding from this. The consequences for global stability would be severe, threatening energy security, vital international trade routes, maybe even the basic norms against military aggression that underpin the international order. The U.S. faces this horrible dilemma. Support your key ally, but desperately try to prevent a catastrophic regional war that could easily involve U.S. troops.
And expect a lot of lawfare and narrative warfare.
Yeah.
Everyone trying to spin this their way in international bodies, in the media.
Or for sure, weaponizing legal arguments, controlling the story. It makes objective assessment and any chance for de-escalation incredibly difficult. And it risks further politicizing international institutions that are already under strain.
And let's just state the obvious brutal fact: the humanitarian cost. If this widens or drags on, civilian populations will bear the brunt. Again, compounding crises that are already horrific. Gaza is dire. A new, bigger war. It's potentially a humanitarian catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale across the entire region.
Finally, this whole crisis is a massive moment of truth for the global non-proliferation regime. You have these Israeli strikes by a state outside the non-proliferation treaty targeting a state inside the NPT over its nuclear program. That strikes at the very foundations of the treaty system.
And if these strikes are seen as somehow successful or legitimate, especially if diplomacy is viewed as having failed,
it could tragically encourage other states to consider similar preemptive military actions in the future that would severely erode the NPT framework, potentially normalizing military force as a way to deal with proliferation concerns.
is there an alternative? Could the shock actually strengthen the regime?
That's the other possibility, perhaps. Maybe the sheer horror of staring into the abyss of a massive regional war could galvanize the international community to finally reinforce non-proliferation norms, properly strengthen the IAEA, and create more robust, credible diplomatic pathways. The long-term health of that whole system feels incredibly precarious right now. How the world responds collectively will set a huge precedent.
Given how unbelievably dangerous this all sounds, the material we've looked at does outline some urgent steps, right? Strategic actions needed from everyone involved to try and pull back from the brink.
Yes, it lays out a kind of roadmap based on the analysis for what's desperately needed from all the key players in the wider international community to prevent this from blowing up completely and maybe start addressing the root causes.
Okay, so for the U.S.
Lead intensive de-escalation diplomacy, basically drop everything else. Establish clear, enforceable red lines for all sides. Forge a unified diplomatic front with other major powers. Reevaluate and adapt the whole Iran nuclear strategy, maybe with a revised framework. And really push regional security dialogue initiatives.
And for Iran,
exercise strategic restraint in how they retaliate. Signal they're genuinely open to credible, verifiable nuclear diplomacy under some kind of revised deal. Grant full, unhindered cooperation to the IAEA for access and monitoring, and take real, visible steps to de-escalate their proxy activities across the region.
Israel's part.
Crucially, cease any further unilateral military actions that could escalate the crisis further. Cooperate fully with U.S.-led de-escalation efforts. Address humanitarian concerns directly and adhere strictly to international humanitarian law. And importantly, be prepared to actually participate in broader regional security talks.
What about the other big players? China, Russia, Europe?
They need to prioritize unified de-escalation, maybe setting aside some rivalries for the moment, consistently and impartially uphold international law, sovereignty, non-use of force, humanitarian law, reaffirm strong support for the IAEA and the non-proliferation regime, and keep pushing Iran for full compliance, support diplomatic solutions over military ones.
And the regional states themselves, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Turkey.
Use their diplomatic leverage actively to support and facilitate de-escalation. Promote regional security frameworks aimed at building trust and managing tensions, and coordinate their responses to the potential humanitarian spillover.
Finally, the UN and IAEA.
Their role is critical. Provide impartial monitoring and reporting military movements, humanitarian situation, nuclear safety, facilitate communication and mediation channels between the parties, lead humanitarian relief efforts and nuclear safety oversight with the IAEA, and, crucially, stand firm in upholding and defending international law and the UN Charter, even under intense political pressure. The analysis paints these as absolutely urgent, necessary steps to navigate this incredibly perilous moment.
Wow, okay, so we've just unpacked the immediate shockwaves, the truly terrifying possibilities laid out in all this material following Operation Rising Lion, those targeted strikes and their deadly consequences, Iran's absolutely furious reaction, the global ripple effects slamming markets and paralyzing diplomacy, and the frankly chilling analysis of what could happen next.
Yeah, as these reports make painfully clear, this isn't just some contained regional spat. It's a full-blown crisis with profound global implications for stability, for the economy, for the very future of nuclear non-proliferation, and maybe even for the fundamental rules we thought governed how nations behave.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's maybe the heavy thought to leave you with, pulling together everything we've just discussed. Given the terrifying potential for miscalculation by everyone involved, the obvious damage done to diplomatic options, and the inherent brutal risks of using preemptive military force risks highlighted by history and starkly by this event, has Operation Rising Lion, as laid out in this material, potentially set the stage for dismantling the entire international system we built, however flawed it was, to manage nuclear threats? Are we now staring down the barrel of a far more dangerous, chaotic, and unpredictable future because of it? What really stands out to you from this deep dive?